Off the Horn of Africa, where the Indian Ocean meets the Gulf of Aden, there is a stretch of coastline that sailors have feared for over 2 decades. Not because of the storms, not because of the reefs, because of the men who came out of it. They came in skiffs, small, fast, armed. They came at dawn when cargo ships moved slow and crews moved slower. And in the years between 2005 and 2012, they took hundreds of vessels hostage, held sailors for ransom, and built something the world had never seen before. Not just a crime wave, a shadow economy. A pirate republic operating in plain sight off the coast of a failed state. But the story of Somalia's pirates is not just about crime. It never was. There are ships that disappeared off this coastline and were never found. There are captains whose names are still whispered in ports from Mombasa to Mumbai. There are stories of buried ransom gold, of cursed vessels that turned on their own crews, of islands nobody puts on maritime charts. Stories that came back from the sea, but carry weight that feels older than the men who told them. This is the full story. The brotherhood that formed in the waters off Somalia. The pirates who became legends. The ships that were swallowed. And the question that sits underneath all of it. Some men went out there and never came back. But some men went out there and never left. Before the pirates, there were the fishermen. That is where this story actually begins. Not with weapons or ransoms or international headlines. It begins with men standing on the shore of a country that had collapsed around them. Somalia's government fell in 1991. What followed was not just political chaos. It was a vacuum. No Coast Guard, no Navy, no authority patrolling the waters off one of the longest coastlines on the African continent. Foreign fishing vessels moved in almost immediately. Industrial trawlers from Europe and Asia swept through Somali waters with nets that scraped the ocean floor clean. Illegal dumping followed. Chemical waste, hospital waste, radioactive material, according to some accounts, sitting on the seafloor a few kilometers from villages where fishermen had fed their families for generations. The fish disappeared. The catches dropped to almost nothing. And the men who had built their lives around the sea found themselves with boats and no livelihood. The earliest groups were not calling themselves pirates. They called themselves the National Volunteer Coast Guard. They went out to confront the trawlers, demanding they leave Somali waters, sometimes forcing them to pay a toll. It was local enforcement in the absence of any state. Rough, sometimes violent, but it had a logic that the men on those shores understood, even if no one else did. What happened next is where the story shifts. Because the money from those early confrontations was significant, and word traveled fast in a country where most people had nothing. Young men who had never fished started showing up on the coast. Former militia fighters, men who had survived the Civil War and had nowhere to put the violence they had learned. They brought weapons. They brought a different set of ambitions. And the Coast Guard fiction gave way to something more honest and far more dangerous. By the mid-2000s, the operations had changed completely. The skiffs were faster. The weapons were military grade. The targets were no longer trawlers. Cargo ships, oil tankers, private yachts, anything moving through the Gulf of Aden with something worth taking. The ransoms were staggering. The MV Faina, a Ukrainian ship seized in 2008 carrying tanks and military hardware, brought a ransom of $3.2 million. The Sirius Star, a Saudi supertanker taken the same year, one of the largest ships ever hijacked, brought $3 million. The money flowing into the coastal towns of Puntland transformed them almost overnight. Isle became the most famous of the pirate ports. A small fishing town on the northeastern coast of Puntland, it became a base of operations unlike anything the modern world had seen. Ships sat at anchor in the bay, while negotiations played out over satellite phone. Crews were held on board, sometimes for months. Businessmen, warlords, traders, all financed the operations in exchange for a cut. It was organized, it had hierarchy, it had rules, and it had captains. The name that surfaces most often is Mohammed Abdi Hassan, known as Afwena, Big Mouth, a former fisherman from Harardhir who became one of the most successful pirate organizers in the region. He did not go out on the skiffs himself. He was the architect. He built networks, managed investors, negotiated ransoms through intermediaries, and reportedly amassed a fortune that allowed him to live openly in Somalia for years, while Interpol had him on their wanted list. Afwena's operation had what investigators described as a stock market structure. Local investors could buy shares in upcoming missions. Returns on a successful hijacking were divided according to agreed percentages. Weapons suppliers, crew, negotiators, investors, everyone got a cut. He was eventually lured to Belgium in 2013 under the pretense of consulting on an anti-piracy documentary. He was arrested at Brussels airport. The film was a sting. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But Afwena was not the only name that carried weight off that coastline. There was Garad Mohammed, one of the key operational leaders of the Puntland networks, linked to dozens of hijackings, described by those who negotiated against him as calm, patient, and completely unmoved by pressure. He was willing to wait as long as it took to extract the maximum price. Negotiations with his group sometimes stretched for 6 months. There were stories about what happened on those ships during the long waits. Crew members in worsening conditions as negotiations dragged on. Ships where the generators failed and crews lived in the heat with no air and little food. Some died in captivity. Not many, because dead hostages reduced the ransom. But the toll on crews who spent months anchored off the Somali coast, uncertain whether anyone was coming for them, was enormous. A Filipino sailor held for over 8 months described the experience years later. The hardest part, he said, was not the fear, it was the routine, the way days dissolved into each other. Some of the pirates were young enough to be his son, but they had guns and he did not, and that was the only thing that mattered out there. The sea had its own version of justice. Not every mission came home. There were skiffs that went out and simply did not return. The waters off the Horn of Africa are not forgiving. Monsoon swells can reach 4 and 5 meters. Sudden storms come up with no warning. The men going out on these missions were often not experienced sailors. They were fighters. Young men who knew how to shoot, but not always how to read the ocean. Some disappearances had explanations. Ships that fought back. Naval vessels from the counter-piracy patrols that moved into the region by 2008. Operation Atalanta. Combined Task Force 151. These patrols intercepted skiffs, arrested crews, and sometimes engaged with lethal force. Men died in those confrontations. But other disappearances had no explanation anyone could produce with confidence. There was a skiff group from Ale that went out in 2010 with 12 men aboard, targeting a bulk carrier moving toward the Gulf. The carrier escaped. The skiff was last seen heading back toward the coast. It never arrived. No wreckage, no bodies. The families waited. The town waited. And after a while, the waiting became a permanent condition. 12 men, gone. The sea gave no answer. The sailors who worked these waters during the worst years brought their own stories back to port. A Greek captain who ran cargo between Djibouti and India spoke about a night his ship was shadowed by something running without lights. Not a skiff, something larger. It paced them for 3 hours off the Somali coast, never closing, never falling back. Then it was gone. He never found an explanation. He said it happened twice.
We have a light on the port bow.
Maritime folklore along this coastline runs deep. Generations of Somali fishermen, Yemeni traders, Arab dhow sailors accumulated stories about these waters over centuries. Ghost dhows seen moving against the wind before a storm. Stretches of coast where the currents behave strangely, where nets come up empty regardless of season, where the compass acts unreliable. Sailors talked about these places and gave them wide berth. The piracy era added new layers to that mythology. Stories circulated in the ports about ships that had been taken, but brought bad luck to everyone involved. A tanker, seized in 2007, reportedly developed unexplained mechanical failures during the weeks it sat at anchor. The ship was released earlier than the negotiations would have suggested. Men who were on that operation spoke about it differently, in the quiet way that people speak about things they do not fully understand. There were stories about buried ransoms. The money was typically dropped by air onto the deck of the seized vessel, stacks of cash in waterproof bags. The pirates would divide it and scatter. But there were always rumors about men who had taken their share and not gone home, who had buried it somewhere along that coast, who had made a plan, and then the plan had gone wrong. Buried gold and buried men. The coast swallowed both.
Keep it steady.
One account that circulated among maritime security consultants described a ransom drop that went missing. A significant portion of the payment for a Greek-flagged cargo vessel was never accounted for after the ship was released. The pirates accused each other. 2 men were killed. The money was never found. Whether it was buried somewhere on the Puntland coast or lost in the chaos, nobody established with certainty. The sea that made these men also consumed them. Part 2 hit 10,012 characters, 12 over. Here it is, essentially at your 10,000 character target. There is a vessel that most people who follow this story eventually come to. Not because it was the largest hijacking, not because it produced the biggest ransom, but because of what happened to it after, and because of what it left behind in the water. The MV Albedo was a Malaysian-flagged cargo ship hijacked in November 2010 with a crew of 23 men from 7 different countries. The negotiations collapsed repeatedly. The owners ran out of money. The insurance ran out. The crew sat on that ship off the Somali coast for over 2 years. The ship deteriorated around them. The food ran low. Several crew members died. The survivors were eventually released in fragments, small groups at a time, as partial payments were scraped together. Some of them had been held for over 26 months. When the last crew members were freed, one of the sailors said something that people who cover this story still quote. "The hardest thing to explain," he said, "was not the suffering. It was the invisibility, the feeling that the world had continued without them, that ships kept moving through those same waters while they sat on a rusting hull watching the Somali coast, wondering if anyone still knew their names. The Albedo itself was left behind. After the crew was gone, the ship sat at anchor off Hobyo for months before it finally sank. The wreck is still there, somewhere off the central Somali coast. Some things the sea keeps. But the sea kept other things too. Things that came before the modern pirates. Things that the modern pirates themselves did not fully understand about the coastline they were working from. The waters off Somalia sit at one of the most historically significant maritime crossroads on Earth. For thousands of years, this was the route connecting the Arab world, the Indian subcontinent, and East Africa. Arab dhow captains understood the seasonal rhythms of the Indian Ocean well enough to sail from Oman to Zanzibar and back in a single year, timing their departure to the monsoon shifts and doing it for over 1,000 years before the first European ship rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Along that route, things were lost. Ships caught in storms, vessels overloaded with cargo that sat too low when the weather changed. Arab sources from the medieval period describe organized piracy off the Somali coast, with shore bases and networks that sound familiar in their basic structure to what emerged in Puntland 1,200 years later. The wrecks are down there, dhows with their cargo still in the hold, trading vessels that were heading somewhere and never arrived. Nobody has mapped them comprehensively because the coast has never been stable enough for such work. In the oral traditions of the coastal communities, there are stories about finding things. A fisherman hauling his nets and bringing up something that was not fish. Coins with markings nobody recognized. Underwater formations that older fishermen described as ruins, though whether these were natural formations or something else, no survey has established. The pirate captains of the modern era were not treasure hunters. They wanted ransoms, not history. But some of them operated in areas where the history had never fully settled into the sea floor, and the folklore moved between them the way it does in places where the sea is close and the past is not very far away. There was a port called Hobyo on the central Somali coast that holds more layers than most. It was the capital of the Sultanate of Hobyo in the 19th century, a small autonomous polity that kept the European colonial powers at a careful distance for decades. The Sultanate was eventually absorbed by Italian Somaliland in the early 20th century, but the town remained. In the modern piracy era, Hobyo became one of the key holding locations for hijacked vessels. For several years, it was essentially an open-air pirate harbor. Ships from multiple ongoing hijackings sat at anchor there simultaneously. Foreign naval patrols could observe them, but could not easily intervene without risking the hostages. There is a satellite photograph from 2010 that circulated in maritime security circles. It shows Hobyo Bay with 5 large commercial vessels at anchor, none of them there by choice, all occupied by their original crews under armed guard. 5 ships. Dozens of sailors, all within sight of a coastline that had once been a sultan's seat of power. The captains who ran operations out of Hobyo were known to the maritime security community, to the naval officers patrolling the area, and to the hostage negotiators who spent months on satellite phones trying to reach agreements. Some of those negotiators wrote about their experiences afterward, and the picture that emerges is complicated. Clan relationships mattered. The division of proceeds followed structures that predated the piracy itself. Agreements once made were generally kept because the whole operation depended on the belief that ransoms would be paid and crews released. With a few exceptions, they were. The exceptions were the ones that became legend. There was a case involving a Taiwanese fishing vessel seized in 2010, whose owners abandoned the ship and crew rather than pay. The vessel was held for over 2 years. By the time some of the crew were finally released through third-party negotiations, several had died. The ship was stripped of everything removable and left. The men who had guarded that vessel for 2 years did not get rich. The investors lost money. The negotiators got nothing. A deal that should have taken 3 months took 30. And the lesson it taught was not that they should be more humane. It was that they needed better intelligence about which ship owners would pay and which would not. The piracy reached its peak in 2011. Somali pirates carried out over 160 attacks that year and held over 700 sailors hostage at any given time. The total economic cost to global shipping was estimated at somewhere between $7 and $12 billion per year. The ransoms themselves were a fraction of that. Most of the cost was what the world spent trying to avoid being attacked. Then, the numbers started to drop. Several things happened at roughly the same time. The international naval presence intensified and became more coordinated. Shipping companies started putting armed security teams aboard vessels in the high-risk area. Legal consequences for captured pirates became more severe, with prosecutions producing real prison sentences. And within Somalia, political changes in Puntland made it harder for the piracy networks to operate openly. By 2013, the attacks had dropped dramatically. By 2016, the Gulf of Aden was no longer the acute threat it had been 5 years earlier. The pirate ports went quiet. Ale and Hobyo went back to being poor fishing towns, smaller than during the peak years because the money had stopped flowing. The men who had made those towns famous scattered. Some were in prison. Some had been killed in confrontations with naval forces or in disputes over ransoms. Some had used their earnings to build businesses in Puntland and beyond. Some were still out there, waiting to see if the conditions that had made the piracy possible would return. The conditions never went away completely. The foreign trawlers came back. The Somali state remained weak and fractured. The young men on the coast still had limited options, and the sea still offered something that the interior did not. The infrastructure of the piracy networks did not simply dissolve when the attack numbers dropped. What changed was the balance of risk. The ransoms were enormous, and the counter-piracy presence was limited. When armed security teams arrived on merchant vessels and the naval patrols became dense enough to catch a meaningful percentage of skiffs, the calculation changed. The men who had done this for money concluded that the returns no longer justified the exposure. But the sea off Somalia is patient. There are sailors alive today who crossed that stretch of water during the worst years and still feel it when they see the Gulf of Aden on a chart. There are men in Ale and Hobyo and Harard here who know what those waters gave and what they took. There are families still waiting for the 12 men from that 2010 skiff. The families have probably stopped expecting an answer, but they have not stopped waiting. The ships that were taken during those years left different kinds of marks. Some were repaired and went back into service, carrying cargo through the same waters where they had once sat at anchor under armed guard. Some were scrapped. Some sank and became part of the seafloor they had been forced to anchor above. The men who held them are scattered now, ranging from prison cells in Europe to comfortable situations in the Horn of Africa. The men who were held on them are scattered too, across the Philippines and India and Pakistan and Romania and Ukraine, carrying whatever they carried out of those months on the water. The sea sent them all. The sea never took them back. The sailors and the pirates and the fishermen and the traders all understood this. The sea does not keep you, and it does not release you. It just continues. The winds shift with the monsoon. The currents run the way they have always run. The dhows and the skiffs and the tankers move through the same channels that the Arab traders used 1,000 years ago. And somewhere on the sea floor, the old wrecks sit beside the new ones. The medieval cargo beside the modern hull. The ransom gold beside the seized ballast. All of it part of the same coastline, the same mythology, the same story that the sea has been telling about this place since before anyone thought to write it down. The sea sent them. The sea never took them back.